Does it seem like everything is about race? That's not an accident, it's a method, and today's book explains it. Today we're looking at Race Marxism by James Lindsay, and we began doing this with the books. We did a little summary before we get into the actual contents of the book, because it gets a little long and gets a little detailed, and we don't go through everything. So first, just so you know what this book is kind of about, again, it's called Race Marxism by James Lindsay. And the thesis, as it were, is rightly understood critical race theory is a reinvention of an older, terrible idea, Marxism, using race as the central construct for understanding inequality, in place of economic class. Critical race theory is race Marxism. So really what most of the book is doing is giving a definition of critical race theory, of Marxism, and what race Marxism would be. But it's essentially that. It's essentially just kind of substituting, instead of the economic concerns, or at least ostensible concerns, of Karl Marx in his works, it's now race. Race is being injected into that and being used in the same way. So much of the discussion around these issues seems disingenuous, and that's because it is. So he breaks down much of how it works, where it comes from, its relationship to philosophical history that precedes it, and the reason you never seem to get anywhere when you discuss things with people who advocate in this way. So as always, we will go through the contents of this book. We're going to do an analysis where we talk about the good and the bad of the book, and then we're going to wrap it all up into a big picture understanding of the world and how it really fits. And just to put it out there, of course, thank you very much. I know these things are slow in coming, and we don't have a visual side to all this stuff yet, but anybody who listens to the audio versions of these podcasts, I much appreciate it. You know, I've been doing this for a long time, and we've read many, many books, but most of these have very important topics and very important things that we need to discuss that need to be out there and need to be better understood. So this one especially is one of those. Race Marxism. The contents. Critical race theory rejects liberalism and freedom. So liberalism historically, this is something that it would have advocated for, are things like freedom and meritocracy. Those are things that it was trying to advocate for, at least the classical liberal ideas. So critical race theory rejects those precepts. And the thing to really keep in mind, that's kind of a central tenet of understanding what's going on here, is that Marxists hate what works. Much of the problem for Marxists as the 20th century unfolded into the 21st century was that capitalism seemed to work so well at pulling people out of poverty and giving people so much that they didn't have before. So that was a problem. For Marxists, they needed capitalism to fail. They needed people to be miserable so that they were willing to engage in the Marxist revolution that was always imminent but never seemed to happen. It really prevents people from a commitment to utopia. So now imagine the setup here, and this is kind of my interpolation. But the whole point is that it's not a good faith disagreement. It's not that Marxists are trying to achieve utopia by whatever means, and so anything that is positive or that helps people or anything like that is good. It's not that way. For Marxists, it's really only one way through the revolution, and anything else, even if it's good, bad, whatever, it's kind of a false world that needs to be torn down. So if you, as a Marxist, make people miserable and make this society miserable and make everything worse, then you are doing the work of the revolution so that people will be committed to the utopia via Marxism. So under this rubric, this idea of Marxism and how it applies, how theorists have applied it via race, is whiteness as property. And this is something that we've seen, especially most recently after Steven Crowder was able to get the manifesto of the shooter in the case of the Christian school. But the idea is that whiteness is property and it must be abolished through conflict. So just like in classical Marxism, it's a matter of the bourgeoisie have the property and their ownership of it must be abolished in order to effectuate the revolution and give it to the non-privileged class. Under race Marxism, whiteness is the property, and whiteness is used as property, so it's something beneficial and abused by white people, and so it must be abolished. And one word that repeatedly comes up and that Lindsay emphasizes a lot is praxis. So praxis is a word that means activism or practice. So that means that you have to be active in trying to effectuate these changes. You engage in activities. You try to effect change. You try to do things as opposed to just sit around and theorize about it. So just like any other kind of a theory like this, it picks a scapegoat, and in race Marxism or critical race theory, the scapegoat is whiteness. So it says all the problems are attributable to whiteness, and therefore if we can just abolish that, then we're going to solve our problems. So Marxism is based on class antagonism, while race Marxism is based on race antagonism. So next section, it's neo-Marxism is what critical race theory kind of falls into. So it has to acknowledge that capitalism works. And in acknowledging that capitalism works, it must now decide that it has to undermine capitalism. Now, this is where kind of the religious precepts come into being. Things like original sin and false consciousness. So the line when it comes to neo-Marxist theorists, or race Marxists, or critical race theorists, is that capitalism tricks people into believing that it's working. It's a trick. It's not actually working. It's not actually delivering people from poverty, or if it is, then that's not what's important, and that's not what needs to be accomplished. So people are subject to this false consciousness and need to be awakened from it and raise their critical consciousness so that they understand that it's false. They hold up an idealized version of society and then engage in critique to explain why it fails to live up to it. And you must engage in praxis to achieve. Now, keep in mind, this is just a matter of tearing down. It's not building. It's just tearing down everything that is. It's the ruthless criticism of all that exists. So, holding up this idealized version of society, really the point isn't even defining an ideal society or a utopia. And of course, the word utopia comes from the roots. I can't remember the specific roots, but it's utopos or something like that. It means not a place, so meaning it doesn't exist. But the point is they aren't really defining something achievable or something they're actually aiming for. The point is to hold up something that's ideal just so you can tear down everything that is. So anything that could possibly be perceived as wrong within society, it's just a tool to be able to use as a means of tearing things down. One of the precepts of this kind of Marxist approach is that society will always be either fascist or communist, and it's better to be communist. So one way or the other, it's going to drive toward fascism, or it's going to drive toward communism, and we want to drive it toward communism, is what their position is. So Herbert Marcuse, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, is a very important theorist along these lines who wrote several books related to this. And some of the things that come out of his ideas and his writings are that violence from the left must be tolerated. So if the left is violent, you have to tolerate it, whatever that violence happens to be. Whereas even the words of the right must be stopped. You have to try to prevent them from being able to even speak, let alone engage in praxis or engage in violence or anything like that. Lindsay offers here that Karl Marx really just wanted other people to take care of him, and that's something that he did was mooch off of other people for most of his life. And so this animated much of his theorizing. But to Marx, there was no world out there. There was not an external world that we were all trying to understand. The entire world is in your head. That means that subjective can become objective. And we can see this in the way that all these things are talked about, is that so much of it, it's about lived experience, it's about the anecdotes, it's about personal perspective, and that you have a perspective and I have a perspective, and there's no way to tell which one's better than the other. But one thing about Marx, and when it comes to labor and, capitalists stealing a person's labor and all those sorts of things, that has always bothered me is that Marx doesn't seem to account for intellectual labor and what value that might have related to an activity. So it's just like if you're trying to figure out how to grow some crop, and somebody their labor is to go out into the world and pick whatever they can find related to this crop, and that's how they get it. So it takes a lot of labor, a lot of walking, a lot of effort, all those kinds of things. And then you have another person who says, oh, wait a minute, why don't we just grab the seeds and we'll relocate the seeds to somewhere closer so that we can harvest more and more consistently. Then there's an act of intellectual labor that's in between those things, and shouldn't that be compensated in the same way? It's just like somebody who starts a corporation and wants to, do things in this way instead of that way, and wants to gather people and get funding and all those. What is the value of the intellectual labor that goes into it? And do you then get to say that somebody's labor was stolen just because it was physical labor as opposed to intellectual labor? Anyway, that's a whole side issue. But another thing here is that Marxism always spends down. It's not something that builds up. It spends down what's already there. That's the reason that it was able to, like a parasitic cyst, that's the reason that it was able to grow on the side of capitalism, is because capitalism's building something and now it spends down. Marxism spends down what's already there. So some of the very particular argument tricks that are used, and this is very useful, actually, and this is how he describes it, I think in one of his podcasts, but this is how it's described, the Mott and Bailey rhetorical trick. There's a rhetorical strategy called the Mott and Bailey that is getting increasingly famous lately. It is one of the central tools of the critical social justice movement. And that strategy, named after a kind of castle, a highly defensible Mott position, like we just want to treat people more fairly, is maintained while also pushing a more radical Bailey position, like we need to radically remake our school system so that no one can fail. Activists advance the Bailey and, when pressed on it, retreat to the Mott, until scrutiny and pressure go away, at which point they return to the Bailey. So this is, such a beautiful encapsulation of exactly what they do, is that they'll have something, and you see this just in your personal life, not necessarily with theorists who are trying to manipulate you or trick you into taking radical positions, but this is something that people do, is that there's something that is a more broad, easily defensible position, and then when they get more radical or specific about it, and you realize how ridiculous that is, then they retreat back to the more broad, defensible position, and they try to put those two things in the same category so that they can smuggle it in. Another one he talks about is the Kafka trap. This is where you twist denial into admission. So whatever you say, if you deny something, like deny you're a racist, deny you're a sexist, deny that you want to help the wealthy or something like that, whatever you're denying, then they say, no, well, that is actually an admission. You saying that you don't want to do it, you saying you're not a racist, you saying that you're not a sexist, is actually what a racist or sexist would say. So it puts you into a trap and just manipulates your words into being an admission, even if it's denial. So he offers methods of getting around this kinds of argument, and I think they're fantastic. How to argue with these kinds of people is you don't give them the benefit of the doubt. Historically, when you're in conversations with people, especially in the United States, is something I found in college, in undergrad, and law school, is that when you're arguing with somebody, you can give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, they will concede certain positions, and they are genuinely trying to have an argument with you, as opposed to just try to defeat you through sheer power. But in these contexts, in the context of today, and the way that these conversations work, it's not like that anymore. There's no good faith on the other side. It's strictly, that's why none of it makes any sense. It's strictly a matter of getting you to obey. That's the only point. So don't give them any benefit of the doubt. They're not trying to have a good faith discussion with you. And also strictly make them follow definitions. So whatever definitions they want to give, whatever terms they want to use, get a definition and make them follow it, because they will be as slippery as humanly possible when it comes to words and the definitions of words. Okay, on to the analysis of this book. Lindsay strikes me as an expert in this area. He really does have a lot to say about this particular context philosophically, and really understanding what they're doing when they're making these arguments and making these assertions. He really follows these things really well. And it's much appreciated because he goes into a lot of detail. He really seems sincerely trying to explain a complex phenomenon that is being abused by nefarious power brokers. It is dense and dives heavily into somewhat arcane philosophy to the average reader. You know, when he talks a lot about Hegel and how Hegel applies to Marx and what Marx thought of Hegel and postmodernism and some other philosophical ideas, he really tries to parse the relationship of the concepts. And it can seem excessive at times, but that's just because we're not as steeped in this kind of philosophy as he is. As is usually the case with these effortful books, multiple readings would be beneficial when trying to really understand all the ideas here. There were several vital concepts, violence from the left being tolerated, whereas speech from the right is prevented. We saw that all through 2020. And even before that, everything that was related to Trump and Trump supporters and what you can do to Trump supporters and punch a Nazi and all that stuff, you could see all of those ideas coming forth. That violence from the left was to be tolerated, whereas even speech from the right was to be considered violence and prevented. Marxists hate what works. This is something to really keep in mind, especially when you're trying to consider what's going on in a lot of our American cities and a lot of European countries. They really want to sabotage the functioning of society because they believe that we have to do that to make people spontaneously engage in the revolution. So it's actually bad if capitalism works and provides for people and draws them out of poverty and gives them better lives. It's actually bad if that happens. Then the argument tricks like we just talked about, the Mott and Bailey rhetorical trick, where you attach a highly defensible concept to a radical concept, and then the Kafka trap where you twist a denial into an admission. So, big picture-wise, it's really most important in the current context to realize that none of these conversations are in good faith. This is a praxis that is being levied upon the population to try to achieve a goal that's related to power. It's not really about winning an argument or having a joust with ideas or anything like that. It's really about just by virtue of sheer power trying to get you to comply. Historically, like I said before, we could have good faith discussions. We had these shared values that we used, appreciation for the country, wanting to see it do well, appreciation for the family, rooted history and religion. All those things were means of connecting us so that we could have good faith discussions about political issues. But we don't have that anymore. It's really a fight. It's pure power against pure power. That's what we're looking at now. They don't care what's true or what is best or whether people will get hurt. They just want to win. However, always understand that at the end of the day, these are people. And this is something that gives me great comfort. Whatever nefarious human being is in the background or collection of them, and whatever nefarious ideas they have, or evil or demonic ideas, or things that they're trying to achieve, and how little they care about other human beings, these are still people. And all of these people were radicalized by a collective process, especially when it comes to the rank and file voters who support these kinds of things. They were radicalized by a collective process, and they can be unradicalized by a collective process. So it's just something that we have to be very deliberate and intelligent about in putting together the way that we counteract all these ideas getting out there in the mainstream. Just piece by piece, locality by locality, idea by idea, we just need to do this. So we'll leave it there on Race Marxism for now. That's by James Lindsay. I encourage everybody to have a look at this book if you haven't already, if you want to understand what's going on in today's world. And we will be having more episodes about these books that we look at, so we can have kind of discussion episodes like we used to. It's just been a huge transition recently, so it's difficult to get back into the swing of things and try to figure out how to bring this content in the best possible way, instead of just me talking to a microphone every couple of weeks. So I really do appreciate it, everybody who's listened. I hope you enjoy learning about these books, and I will see you on the next one.